All right, Matt, why don't you start recording and we'll get going. Thank you. All right, so welcome. This is our second meeting of the Climate Friendly Area Work Group. Appreciate everyone being here today. What I intend to do with this meeting is kind of talk through, I don't have draft language at this point, but talk through the concepts that we're looking to advance based on our earlier conversation, and get additional input or thoughts from you all on those changes. I think the first thing that I'd like to do is to actually share a little bit of draft language. I do have one piece here that I can share that is basically looking at how we reconcile goal 10, the requirements of Oregon Revised Statute 197296 in terms of housing needs analysis with the climate friendly area language that we've been looking at. And so we will be including in the packet for our next RAC meeting revised language for Division 8. And I'm going to show you just a little excerpt from that to try, and hopefully it makes sense. But basically what we are, and I'll make this a little bit bigger, that may be kind of hard for people to read. There we go. The part that I've outlined here is really in a nutshell the way we are proposing to navigate between our goals for climate friendly areas to get to that 30% of housing units within climate friendly areas, over time, while continuing to remain consistent, compliant with the requirements of Goal 10, administrative rules, and so on. And so, in a nutshell, this is kind of the way we do that. So, Section C here. The local government shall calculate the climate-friendly area needed as provided in OAR 660-012-0315 sub 2. And what that is again, it's that theoretical building envelope calculation that we've talked about. So in terms of figuring out how much climate-friendly area a local government needs, that is the methodology. So how much land area needs to be zoned that way in order to comply with this requirement. At the same time, the local government shall determine housing capacity within those climate-friendly areas for the purpose of meeting identified housing needs as required by Goal 10 administrative rules consistent with provisions of 197296 sub 5, which I will share with you now. And so that piece is excerpted here. So this is a statutory requirement for kind of how cities look at their housing capacity. And the requirement is very clear. It must be based on data relating to land within the UGB that has been collected since last review. And you look at things like the number, density, average mix of housing types of development that have actually occurred, looking at trends in density and average mix of housing types, et cetera, et cetera. Our goal is for, over time, these two things to converge so that, ultimately we'd like to see 30% or more of housing units within climate-friendly areas, at which point, we're kind of synced up between this language and our aspirational goals. But in the interim, cities will continue to plan to meet their residential needs based on this process. So we'll share the language in more detail in the packet, but I wanted to first bring that forward here because I think this is a very important point, and we don't want to upset the apple cart in terms of how cities plan for housing and meet their residential needs, throughout in the variety of housing types that are called for. And we believe this mechanism will work. Are there And I know I'm just kind of dropping this in your laps, but if there are any initial thoughts or comments or concerns, I'd like to hear from you.
Could you show the earlier paragraph, Kevin? Because I actually forget what it says. And it's new language we don't have. Is that correct?
That's right. I mean, it's similar to what we have in Division 8, but what we've tried to do is be a little more clear in terms of how we're separating, how we determine how much climate-friendly area is needed, and then how local governments will continue to meet their identified housing needs through the H&A. So while you're looking at that, Mary Kyle, I'll go ahead and turn to Al. It looks like he's got his hand up.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, this is new language that I haven't seen before, but it really looks to me as if it does in a much clearer way what I had been hoping would be the case. And I think it does a good job of reconciling the two methodologies and making clear that we are not confusing them or having them overlapped or one preempt the other. So I'm very happy about that. I will still have some thinking to do about what happens when you end up with an analysis that shows that you can't meet all of the needs that are identified in your housing needs analysis. And then you have to go to that second step where you're looking at efficiency measures, doing that before you look at expanding the urban growth boundary. And I would assume that when you're doing efficiency measures that you that efficiency measure analysis in terms of what goal 10 says is needed in terms of housing types and ownership opportunities and rental opportunities and proximity and all that kind of thing, that those won't be distorted by this this process either. We'll be looking at what is required to meet housing needs as opposed to what meets transportation or climate change needs.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead, Mary Kyle.
I think critical to that, and I'm just trying to get, I'm gonna have to let this settle in and think about it, about the timing of the various pieces, because I think and how they integrate. But I want to be clear, or maybe remind people, because that the housing needs identified as required by Goal 10 should be informed by House Bill 2003, which is, we know, is going to give us a different picture than what traditional H&As have been telling us about housing need. We already know that from the reports that on 2003, that our current way of doing H&As has resulted in kind of perpetuating the same inequities and understating the need for smaller and diverse and more affordable housing types. So I think that will actually reinforce the need for more diverse and affordable housing types in CFA type areas. So I just want to make sure that that timing is all flowing together on what it means to meet the housing needs as identified by Goal 10.
Sure. And to be clear, as we're conceptualizing this,
right,
a local government that's charged with doing this work can essentially use their adopted and acknowledged H&A as the basis for determining 30% of what, right? So there's no requirement to update an H&A. Local governments may want to do that prior to this, or they may be scheduled to do an H&A update prior to the CFA process, or
they may be funded to do it, because there's a lot of funding that's actually gone out for updated, H&As, and 2003 should be informing those. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And so that whole, the next step of the housing production strategy and all of that will kick in.
Yeah.
Let's see, Damien.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Kevin?
Yeah.
Now, Al had his hand up and then it's down now. So I'm assuming that means, Al, you're good?
I'm good.
Okay, thank you. So I want to ask a really simple question here because it's like Monday after holiday weekend. So as I'm reading C and I'm thinking ahead to what this might look like for the city, are we looking at the capacity that will be provided in a CFA as part of the kind of what I'm going to call the buildable land inventory phase and capacity phase pre-efficiency measures, or is the expectation or the option then to look at your CFA as a potential efficiency measure under, and I define the reference 296 sub 9. And I hope that makes sense.
I think so. And so, there's a difference between how I think this would be initially implemented and then how in the future, this would play into, the efficiency question. I think, at the outset, local governments will be looking at, okay, what's the total amount of climate friendly area needed based again on the building envelope and our zoning and all of that calculation. The amount of buildable land that can be assumed within those areas is based on past production within those areas. So if you have areas that are currently zoned, basically consistent with those CFA standards, you would then look to recent production housing data within those areas to say, okay, this is what we can rely on, in terms of our anticipated capacity. Obviously, our goal is to increase that capacity over time. But per the way the statute operates, we have to base the current analysis on past production.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
It does. I mean, I think I'll be like other people today where I need to kind of think about this and process it before I can respond competently like, yep, I think you're on the right track, or wait a minute, I thought of another question.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. And I am kind of dropping this in your laps and, want to allow time for that as well. Al, looks like you have another comment.
Just perhaps my response to Damien's question would be that the CFA capacity calculation and the whole climate friendly area rulemaking project and those policy issues would be relevant in selecting among various kinds of efficiency measures. They'd be very relevant, but they wouldn't be controlling. They would be like other kinds of factors that go into selecting efficiency measures.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see, any other comments or questions from folks on this? Allow some time for this to percolate. All right, I can certainly stop sharing because looking at text is pretty boring. I see there's a chat here. Oh, okay, from Molly. Please scroll back down to the rest of the new language. Well, I'm not sure what that is referring to, Molly, if you want to come off mute.
Sure. I thought that when I first came on, there was other highlighted text below that. And I thought that was, you were talking that related to this. So
I was, but that highlighted text is actually from existing statute, ORS 197296. So okay. The new language is this piece here. And really, I've just highlighted this excerpt because it kind of summarizes in a nutshell how we're thinking this would work over time. So again, I'll share we'll see the whole language in the next packet, but this is just kind of at the concept level. All right. Okay, I'll go ahead and stop share, and we can talk through some other items. Let's see. All right, so that's kind of a big piece that we've been working on. The other thing that we've talked about already And I just kind of want to give you a sense of sort of preliminary direction. And again, on some of these items and allowing opportunity for dialogue and, input on that. The next thing I want to talk about is this phased implementation timeline. So again, with the current draft, the cities, local governments would be required within 1 year to kind of identify those climate-friendly areas and do that equitable housing outcomes analysis with then the development of basically the development standards in the next year. I think at this point, based on what I'm hearing, concerns with timeline and also caveat what I'm saying with the other kind of larger concept that you've also heard about of the idea that a local government might be able to propose a work plan to step through the different requirements, the climate-friendly, equitable community requirements in total. So that would allow some flexibility, but outside of that process, what we're settling on, or what I'm thinking the direction we're heading here is, I think what I indicated in our first meeting, which is basically having step one be identification of those CFA study areas and analysis of equitable housing outcomes. So this would require submittal of a report detailing things like the public involvement process, the data and analysis of these areas, considerations of each potential CFA area. Why are we doing that? I know some have asked the question of, why don't we just give local governments 2 years to get to the finish line? The reason is that we want to be able to, as an agency, have an ability to sort of check in, see how folks are doing this work, since it's brand new and nobody's really done this before. We want to take a look at sort of the CFA areas you're identifying, the analysis that you're using, the methodology, all of that stuff, so that we have an opportunity to provide more helpful input earlier in the process, not wait till you get to the finish line and then say, oh, wait a minute, that didn't seem like it was consistent with how we were thinking these rules would operate. So year one, it would be a report with those pieces. By year two, it would be adoption of the full package of development standards for those climate-friendly areas. Unless that local government had developed a work plan with some different deadlines. Now, I will say that the land use piece of the puzzle is pretty fundamental, and I think that it makes a lot of sense for us to require this work to be done early on in the process versus later. We don't want to see a TSP developed and then have land uses change after that point. That said, I think we're willing to consider, being somewhat flexible, because as we reach out to local governments, we're hearing, all of these folks are kind of in different places in terms of the work that's happening, TSP updates, comp plan amendments, and so on. Sandy, looks like you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so to clarify, Kevin, when you're talking about the year one, in which the jurisdictions would be looking at where we would be designating these climate-friendly areas, are you including adoption of those climate-friendly areas into our comprehensive plan within that first year, or does that come along with the implementation of year two?
Year two, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. Yeah, so year two is the development regulations and adoption of the comp plan amendments. So that first step is not a land use decision. It is a report filed with the department. It would be publicly available. If people wanted to review and comment on it, they would be able to do so, but there wouldn't be a formal sort of thumbs up or thumbs down process. It would be essentially, reporting to us on local government progress. Okay, Oriana?
Yeah, similar to a disclaimer that was made earlier, forgive me if this question is a little bit rusty, but how are you taking into account environmental justice factors in allowances for different jurisdictions in this planning process. Because I can see ways that this can be approached that are a little bit easier in certain communities that have more infrastructure already and are already more climate friendly, but much more difficult in communities that have more environmental justice factors, fewer trees, less public transportation, more industry that's impacting a community. So how are you encouraging cities and providing the technical assistance necessary to kind of make, to make a basketball metaphor a little bit more of like a 3-point or a half-court shot instead of a layup in how this gets approached and how these benefits? I know equity and justice are embedded in this, but I can also see a lot of cities, like say a Hermiston, having a much bigger path to go up than certain parts of the.
Oops, you cut out there at the end, but I assume you were done. Yeah, that's a good question, and we recognize that local governments are going to be in different places in terms of infrastructure, facilities to support alternative transportation modes and other things. In part, that's why some of the draft rules in Division 12 in particular are less specific about certain types of required improvements, because we know that local governments are in a different places. Some have bus rapid transit, most don't. Some have, a lot of bike lanes, some have few. So we do need to be sensitive to that. And so I think there's a myriad of ways that we're looking at addressing this issue. One of the things that we're looking at specifically with CFAs is something we've talked about a little bit already in this work group, which is we've got a minimum dimensional requirement for CFAs. And part of the reason for that is that what we're seeing are, well, a number of people have voiced concerns that if these areas are too narrow, you are essentially reinforcing kind of a segregated pattern of, well, multifamily is only along the transit lines, and we have our, single family enclaves outside of that area. That is part of the reason we're proposing a minimum dimensional standard to get, more of that diversity baked into the paradigm. Sandy.
Yeah, going back to earlier, with this timetable you have of the 1 year and 2 year, do you, as the jurisdictions are looking at applying these rules and creating these climate friendly areas, do you see the potential for any kind of rulemaking tweaks to address issues that came up in terms of, is this really practical when we start applying it on the ground?
That's a good question. I mean, certainly, I think, we are putting forward a kind of an experimental, paradigm for getting to the goals we want to get to. And if we're finding that over time we're off the mark, then I do think adjustments to the administrative rules will be necessary. And I think we're willing and able to do that. I know, and I don't want to jump from one issue to the other, but I know, Sandy, that one of the issues that you've raised, and I'm hearing this also of, I think Matt raised this, is the concern that, for some of the larger cities, you're not seeing a level of development, at the anywhere near kind of what our aspirational goals are for those larger cities. So 85 feet in height and, certain density mixes and so on and so forth. One of the adjustments that we are looking to make in the next draft is to basically allow local governments to have a little more choice in terms of the CFA parameters. And so what I mean by that is, in concept, what we're thinking is, yes, you would have to establish a core CFA area that would meet that kind of 85 feet and the certain, a allowing for certain minimum densities and so forth. But other CFA areas, you would be able to really kind of adjust the scale based on where you think that market is. The practical result of that will be the area covered by those CFAs is necessarily going to need to be larger, because if it's a lower scale, you know, the level of intensity you're going to get would be less. But frankly, you know, we understand that we want to, again, we want to leverage the market as much as we can, but we also understand that, you know, folks who are on the ground in your local markets have a better sense of what's getting developed now. We do want to make that a little aspirational. We do want to make some headway, but that would be a technique that would allow a little more local control, if that makes sense. So before I go to Mary Kyle, Sandy, is that kind of what you were asking about, or?
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're looking at making your existing rules a little more flexible. And that may take care of the need. I'm just wondering, when you were talking about year one, you were saying, you know, this is that DLCD wants this report back and that you want to be involved and see how things are going. And so it seems like taking that the step further, that there could be an openness to doing some tweaks, and just wondering if you had gotten that far in your thinking.
Oh, I see. At that 1 year mark.
Yeah.
You know, I think that is the opportunity for more engagement and assistance. I don't know, frankly, you know, what that's going to look like at this point in time, but that would certainly be a time for potential course correction or what have you, if needed, if it was looking necessary.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right, Mary Kyle.
I think the fact that DLCD and the commission are already looking at changes to the House Bill 2001 rules, because there was some glitch in a couple different parts, is evidence that if there's, you know, if something in the technical aspects of implementation isn't working, I don't doubt that the department will be taking that up. But I want to make clear, at least my impression is that this is not aspirational, nor is it a 2 to 5 year market timeframe that we are looking at. This is significant change in how we've done housing policy for the last, how we have zoned, not housing, how we've implemented Goal 10 over the last 20 years plus, which is not today, aside from the climate rulemaking, it is not meeting the housing needs of today's and future residents who need more affordable, closer in, smaller housing options. The climate friendly rulemaking is giving us an avenue to really up that game, but this is not aspirational. This is required. We have to do this. This is about the climate, and we need a significant change in how we've been doing housing to meet the housing needs of Oregonians and our climate needs. And I look back at that 2003 report that DLCD and the Housing and Community Services Agency did, which says that we have, it is clear that accommodating the housing needs that will serve the current housing needs and the projected housing needs of moderate and lower income households requires changes to the existing mix and density of housing types. But under current housing capacity analysis, we're not doing that. We're not meeting it. So even aside from this climate rulemaking, we really need to fundamentally do things differently. And local governments need money to be able to do that. Absolutely. But I think we all need to get on the same page. We got to be doing this. Local governments need money to do it. And that there is a quote again from the same report, an inextricable link between housing policy and climate mitigation. These go together, and it's not aspirational, and it's the market building it today. This is making sure for a 2050 timeline that we're going to be meeting that capacity in climate friendly areas. Sorry, a little of the soapbox, but I have no doubt if there's tweaks on technically implementing that, DLCD will be looking at rule changes, but the fundamentals have just got to be clear and stable, it seems to me.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Jonathan, you came on screen. I wondered if maybe that you had something you wanted to add.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, first of all, I agree with what Mary Kyle just said about this is not aspirational. And I was kind of concerned when I've heard you drop our aspirational goals a couple times. I did want to comment on the, I guess two things. One is if I were a local juror, if I were doing what I used to do, in which we did things kind of like what we're doing now, I would probably think of the process of going from identifying what our zoning might be and identifying where those areas that we rezone might be as part of the continuum to get to the end where we actually adopt new zoning, new land use designations, new code, and those sort of things. So in terms of the reporting in after a year, I think of a jurisdiction's able to think of that as at the beginning of the process, they're initiating their comprehensive plan amendment process. And this is one of the steps that they have to get to on a work plan. I think that will work. Other than like we talked about before, not having to go through 2 hearing processes and such. But I think it's likely that that you look, it at least takes a year and a half, to get through the public process, and so that that could just be part of the continuum of having to check in with the LCD staff. In terms of the conversation about the width of the climate-friendly areas, the centers, as it were, 2 things. One is I think it needs to be clear to make a climate-friendly community as opposed to climate-friendly areas, which are a particular part of the climate-friendly area. That corridors are part of that strategy, that main streets are part of that strategy, that we also need to be thinking about what happens outside of the climate-friendly areas and the rest of to make the rest of the community a climate-friendly community. And so I'd love to be able to understand or see visually how we come up with this concern about equity. Is it a concern that they won't put that the jurisdictions won't put the right density of housing in the climate-friendly areas, that they'll try to put it all in the corridors, and I'm not clear to me that there's actually, I'd like to see the sort of the basis of the reasoning rather than just the description of here's a reason for having the width. I think I'll stop at that. It's just some thoughts have come up as you've been talking. Any question on what I just said?
No, I think I'm following you, Jonathan. And I will drop, there's a couple of recent articles that talk about kind of the negative results that can occur if we zone those areas too narrowly. But I understand what you're saying. And I would say, to remember that with climate-friendly areas, we're talking about, mixed use, like full-blown mixed use areas that you may also, as a local government, want to be putting higher densities in some of those areas. They're not going to be CFAs, but they, would still, I think, support transit service, that kind of TOD development that local governments have been doing for some time. So there's nothing in the rules that would necessarily preclude that. So I will go ahead and drop those studies into the chat. So you can take a look at them. But let's go ahead. Is there another question? Go ahead, Eunice.
This kind of reminds me of the fact that there's also a bunch of other land use regulations that are going to apply to residential neighborhoods or areas, mixed use areas, commercial areas. And I'm wondering, are we going to have an opportunity to walk through those additional regulations, which I think are rules that apply citywide outside of the CFAs? Because some of that gets to connections between residential neighborhoods and amenities, et cetera.
I'm sorry, Eunice, could you repeat that? I'm
No, I was just
terrible at
saying,
multitasking.
I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to walk through the other land use regulations that are in the rules that are applying outside of CFAs and that apply citywide. I think if I'm remembering correctly, I don't have it in front of me, that there's a whole section that applies to mixed use areas or to commercial areas or to residential neighborhoods and their connection to other areas. Is that going to be kind of fleshed out at some point?
You know, that's a really good point, Eunice. I mean, initially this work group was billed as both climate friendly areas, but also the other land use requirements that apply elsewhere. I think because of the interest we've received, we've kind of tended to focus on CFAs. But I think this is the venue for that conversation. However, what I don't want to do is kind of drag this group through an excruciating review of draft code language. So I guess I would suggest let's cut to the chase. If there are concerns with those land use requirements, let's talk about it. What provisions are concerning, and what changes do people suggest we make to them?
Well, again, I'm sorry I don't have them in front of me.
Yeah.
The one section I do remember hoping there'd be more clarity is the low CAR district. And I know
Yep.
that applies to larger jurisdictions, which would include Salem. Because if I remember correctly, a lot of the other ones are more design standards, you know, like windows or orienting entrances towards streets or transit, etc., which, you know, make more sense to me versus a low CAR district and what exactly that is and where that would apply.
Yeah, I can speak to that just briefly, and I'm not the expert really in you know, in these things, but as we intend that rule, that portion of the rule to function, it would say local governments need to allow for these areas to be established. It's not saying you have to zone certain areas to be low CAR districts. It's really enabling. If there's say a neighborhood that comes together and says, hey, we want to be a low CAR district. We'd like to put in, I don't know, we'd like to have our street function for more than just automobiles and introduce some, you know, traffic calming measures or what have you. It would be basically allowing for that to occur and putting in place standards that would enable that to occur, but not requiring a low CAR district. That's what I know about in terms of the intent of what we're trying to accomplish there.
So that's more something that would potentially be in our TSP as like a design option. And if I get too in the weeds, I can always just email you. I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it seems like it could be in a TSP. Could it be in a development code? Maybe. You know, I'm not sure that we have necessarily settled on where that might live in local government regulations, but could see either option potentially. And I know there are other staff. Unfortunately, a number of our staff weren't able to attend the meeting today, but we can get back to you with more information on that if that would be helpful.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Let's see. I'm just reviewing the chat here. Okay. I will send, I had a request for the assessment report for the regional housing needs analysis study that was done under House Bill 2003. I'll drop that in the chat for everyone here in just a minute. Let's see. Are there other questions before we move on? Anything else on the land use requirements? That anybody else have some concerns or issues they'd like to raise? Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I have a question about 330 parens 4.
Yep.
So front and side yard requirements, that's citywide? We have to get rid of front and side yard setback requirements, or is that just in CFAs?
It is intended to apply citywide. And I'm gonna see if I can pull up my copy of the rules as well. So speak knowledgeably about what's in there. Yeah, I recognize that section poses some challenges for people in terms of implementation. I will say that I think it is intended to apply citywide. As I recall, that language was a little less than mandatory, but it's a little murky, and we certainly need to we need more clarity in that section. And so, Matt, if you have a suggestion, I think that would be welcome. I will say I think broadly the intent of that section is to think about, with those side yard setbacks in particular, we're also creating the infrastructure requirements. You know, it has implications for cost of street improvements, cost of sewer improvements, because the further apart houses are, the more those costs add up. I think that was part of the thinking in that section, but yeah, I can actually share it. I've got it here if that would be helpful.
If you want to pull it up, I mean, otherwise, it seemed to me like there was some flexibility in it, but I haven't read this since before the holidays, so.
Sure. So just for the good of everyone, let me make this a little bigger so people can see it. So subsection 4 of section 0330, cities and counties must have land use regulations in residential neighborhoods, and this is throughout the city, that provide for slow neighborhood streets, comfortable for families, efficient, sociable development patterns, and provide for connectivity within the neighborhood and to adjacent districts. Land use regulations in residential neighborhoods must include front yard and street side yard setbacks must be limited or zero. Where a setback more than 0 is required, the city or county must set a standard that aims to minimize the total width of the existing or planned street right-of-way and required setback on each side of the street. Okay. So yeah, it's a little fuzzy in my opinion in terms of the language. Matt, did you want to speak more on that?
No, it is, I think, a little ambiguous, so, which is fine, I guess. I just don't quite know what the aims to minimize the total width, etc., means and how we comply with that requirement exactly. I don't know if it needs to become, you know, more explicit or anything like that. I just kind of wonder how we comply with that. So
yeah, I'm just making some notes here because I think that will be helpful to us. Oh, Oriana. Like
yeah, how did you think through the cultural impacts of this particular approach? I understand the importance from a climate perspective, but some communities, front yards and front porches are really important for community building and socialization. In particular, white communities tend to prefer backyards. So how is this being offset with approaches that ensure that there are spaces for communal gathering and ways that front yards have served a purpose in many communities for a long time are still preserved, and that a climate-friendly area doesn't do detriment to the cultural fabric and the social fabric of a community?
Yeah, that's a good question, Oriana. I guess I would say, I think just speaking to sort of traditional, well, not traditional, there are, I think, a number of planning concepts that aim at actually bringing more life to the street, bringing people closer to the street, you know, allowing for better interaction between pedestrians and people who live in the neighborhoods. And so reducing that distance wouldn't necessarily preclude that public engagement, but I think your point is a good one. And so I don't know what the appropriate balance would be, but thank you.
One suggestion might be, especially in more mixed use areas, thinking about how how community spaces are defined, like in a building that has multiple functions, or businesses that bring community together. It might be that you might want to encourage jurisdictions without doing any kind of mandating to just better understand how this potential kind of new rule direction is going to have impact on certain communities, and to work with those communities as they're defining climate friendly areas to really leverage that flexibility we talked about earlier to make sure that some of the rules that get put in place at the local level are accounting for how community wants to interact. And if in particular a community that's being displaced from one area or is even being brought closer in through a climate friendly area, that those communities are designed in ways that meet the cultural needs, because that's a really big issue around displacement, is when you don't have the kinds of cultural businesses, or you just don't have the design of a community that fits how a community lives, that can have a really, really detrimental impact and lead to people not wanting to stay in that particular area. So I think there's a way to provide some direction without mandating, and to provide some encouragement and maybe even some technical resources to communities to make sure that not just this, but any aspect of a climate friendly area is accounting for the culture of that particular community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, thank you. I think that is a very good point. I'm sorry, I'm trying to also monitor stuff that's going on in the chat here. So a lot of good input here. Sandy, see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to make a point that I put in the chat to you, picking up on the last two commenters when we're reducing setbacks and then putting doors facing the streets, that putting them onto a residential door facing onto an arterial street that's so close is not always going to be the way to build that community, as Oriana was suggesting. And so, I mean, I think if we look at maybe amending that next section of B of item 4, that be required for local streets, but it may not always be appropriate for collector or arterial streets to have the front doors going right out onto that main street.
Yeah, good point. All right. All right. I thought I saw another hand up there. Oh, Bob. Yeah.
Thanks. I want to focus on the street connectivity requirements, and again, encourage the department to put in specific numerical standards. You know, a well-connected, fine-grained network of streets is really essential to creating the kind of communities or neighborhoods that the department draws a great word picture about. You know, that we want walkable places. And you showed, for example, you know, downtown McMinnville in your various community conversations about this. If you look carefully at almost any downtown in Oregon, you'll find that the block sizes are 250 to 350 feet. They're usually rectangular in size. And as someone who spent 25 years implementing the transportation planning rule, I can tell you that without a specific standard or minimum in your rule, you're not going to get local governments to change those standards. We had very similar requirements from the early 90s, and the various other interests that want to just keep things as they are not going to choose voluntarily to implement the kind of standards that are necessary. So my suggestion is that you include a specific standard, at least require that they continue the existing pattern of streets, and set a maximum size on the length of streets in a CFA, or block length in streets in CFAs. And 350 would be an absolute kind of minimum to have for that.
Thanks for that, Bob. Yeah, question for you. I think you know, we had, I think, that proposal in the draft, in the first draft that came out. And I think a lot of local government folks said, well, gosh, our whole downtown is built on a different dimension. What I have seen, and I think what's workable, is a standard that says, you know, in lieu of a street connection, say with a substantial redevelopment of a block that exceeds those standards, you might provide public pedestrian and bike access through block access. What would you think of that as kind of a middle ground that kind of meets the pedestrian and alternative access
Well,
goals?
I think you need both. You should set, again, the standard I would set is continue the existing network and then set a minimum block length. And 350 would be, 100 feet above what the department was recommending previously, which was 250 feet. I also think there ought to be a hierarchy, a priority that says the first order thing you should do is provide a street connection. That's what works best for mixed use development and for pedestrians. If you can't get a street at that interval, then yes, look at an alley or an access way. And the rule already includes exemptions if there are physical obstructions that can easily be included here. But again, I think you need strong numerical standards to guide this work by local governments, or you're not going to get much in the way of a response.
Okay, thank you. Well, while we're on that topic, I'll open up the floor for anybody else who wants to speak to that issue of the block dimensional requirements, different ways we could approach this in rule. All right then. I did drop a copy of DLCD's report on the regional housing needs analysis in the chat. So that is the piece that was referenced earlier. Basically, the House Bill 2003 report that was required to look at a different methodology for assessing housing needs statewide. So, for those who are interested. Let's see. Yeah, I guess we were kind of generally on the topic of land use requirements. Are there any other concerns or issues that people wanted to talk about before we get back to the climate friendly area specific standards? Sandy.
Yeah, number 6 of that same section.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong place. I'll lower my hand. I'm got mixed up.
No worries. Section 6 does relate to that low car district piece that we were talking about earlier. So I'll just bring that up for the good of the order, so people can look at it and better understand kind of what we're talking about here. So Section 6, cities and counties with an urban area over 100,000 in population must have reasonable land use regulations providing for the development of low car districts. These districts must be developed with no car or low car streets where walking or using mobility devices are the primary methods of travel within the district. Cities and counties must make provisions for emergency vehicle access and local freight delivery. These districts must be permitted in locations where residential or mixed use development is permitted. As I read this, it sounds to me like the intent is really to say, hey, if a developer comes forward and says, I'd like to build one of these, or if a neighborhood comes forward and says, hey, we would like to transition this area to a low car district, city and county would have to have a process in place that would enable that to occur. All right. Oh, good. Okay, got some good stuff.
You're gonna have a hard time getting moving trucks in to move people in and out of there.
Yes. Although if you can get a fire truck in, one would hope you could get a moving truck in, but yeah.
True, but a fire truck is usually is permissible to block the road. Moving trucks are, to block the mobility, and that's not the same case for moving trucks, so.
Yeah.
For what it's worth too, I'll just throw in that, there's a lot of stuff that's been coming out of the Netherlands on the concept of what's called like an autoluw, which is like a very low car free street that just allows for maybe like basic local traffic or, moving trucks to come in and out. I'll share that link just so you can see what that looks like. It doesn't necessarily have to mean all traffic is completely blocked off from this road, but the idea is that it's a space for pedestrians and not for cars.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate it. Sandy?
Okay, so I found the next thing I wanted to bring up on number 7,
Oh, okay.
letter F, big C. So this is, F is about regulations that require the jurisdiction to provide notice to public agencies about things that are happening on the transportation facilities. So the first 2, A and B, make sense to me. Land use applications that require public hearings, and B, subdivision and partition applications. But C seems really broad, other applications which affect private access to roads. So like a driveway onto a street, we send notice to the MPO. I mean, C just seems really broad.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. I have to think that this is, I mean, the intent here has to do with access management.
Sure, and I agree that that's the intent.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's you know, when you look back at 7, you know, those are to protect the transportation facilities and corridors. But I'm just thinking there's got to be a better way. And I guess I'd like to know what really are we trying to do here? I mean, could this be an encroachment permit kind of thing that we have to give notice to ODOT and such? And is it just their road that we would send notice, or any road within the city?
Yeah, I think it needs to be tightened up. As I read this section, I believe the intent here really is just better coordination between all of these planning groups here. It's about providing notice. It's not requiring any kind of permit, at least in section F here, 7F. But I think we can probably tighten up this language a little more clearly to, oh, Matt, did you have something? Looked like maybe you wanted to offer something.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't think you should be too worried about this one. It's been in the TPR for decades.
Oh.
So presumably you've already complied with it. This is drawn from 0045, existing text, and it appears to be brought over verbatim. So whatever you did to comply with 0045.
Apparently met that standard.
All right, we'll just keep doing that.
Okay. Go figure. There's a lot of fun stuff in the TPR. Go ahead, Matt.
There is, and that's why I wanted to check, because I remember that quite a bit of what went into 330 was just taken from 0045 because of the way it's splitting out now with cities and metropolitan areas using basically rules 100 through 999, and the rest of the state will stay using the rules that are below 100 for the most part. So, but who knows? Maybe nobody really knew what it was meant back when it was prepared the first time.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Jonathan.
Sure, thanks. Well, two comments. One is, I hope for the next last RAC meeting that you will distinguish what is new proposed code in this section from what is existing TPR, so that we wouldn't. I found it very difficult to have to try to compare the two, and time consuming. The second question is, I understand, I just want to make sure, I want to clarify that 330 is something that will have to be complied with when the TSPs are updated, which is right now has this undesignated timeline. Is that correct? Is that my assumption correct on that?
That's a good question. I'm reading through the text here in 0330, the text box at the beginning. And Matt, if you have a sense of this, go ahead, feel free to jump in.
I was just looking at the new rule 12, which sets various deadlines, and since I don't see anything in there that would make 330 become active any sooner, it's, yeah, in general, when adopting an update to a TSP, or when adopting any land use changes. I mean, you certainly couldn't adopt a land use change that went away from the direction of what's in 330.
I guess my comment here, of course, is that if this is part of the urgency of providing for changes to communities to have climate-friendly communities that address greenhouse gas emission reductions and light vehicles, that maybe we should have some certainty about when those are going to be applied, and they should be sooner than later, because we're running out of time to make effective changes, given the fact that it takes a long time for development to catch up with new zoning and new regulations. Thanks.
That's a good point, Jonathan. You know, and I'll note, I mean, the heading of this section is land use requirements. And so I guess to me, it begs the question of, is this a TSP or is this a development code update? I think we should give that question some more thought and maybe clarify this issue. Yeah, thank you. All right. Any other comments on the land use requirements section? Okay, seeing none, I will turn back to the CFA changes that we're looking to make with the next draft. So we talked about phased implementation, and we're going to change that. We'll have the study instead of the you know, any kind of land use decision for the first step of CFA designation or identification. One of the other issues we talked about last time is allowing for more diverse housing types, more residential ownership opportunities. I think the solution that we're leaning towards in terms of amending the rule would be to allow local governments to determine other building types allowed in CFAs that can meet the minimum density standards. So in essence, the rules would say, here's the minimum densities. Local governments, you can sort out which housing types are achievable at those densities and allow for them. I think we would have a base requirement. You must allow multifamily housing, yes, but allow a little more local government discretion to define housing types. So that's one thought there. Hopefully allowing for more ownership opportunities, greater diversity of housing types. We also, I think, talked about reporting on the construction of accessible units within CFAs, within the climate-friendly areas. So again, we would, as part of that required reporting of housing production in climate-friendly areas, looking for specific, like how many accessible units got developed within the climate-friendly area. We know the need is much greater than what is being produced by the market or even by nonprofit housing developers. So it's something that we'd like to see more of. We need to see more of there. Another idea that we're considering is there is an allowance in the current draft that basically allows local governments to count additional, like a height bonus. So if a developer comes in and says, hey, I want to build this many affordable units to allow the heights to go a little taller than what the local government would allow outright, or I should say, you know, based on the general standard. Expanding that kind of bonus to also apply to construction of accessible dwelling units, again, because that's an important housing need. And so incentivizing more development of accessible dwelling units beyond what the building code. There are some minimum requirements for multifamily that get built. So this would be kind of an incentive for more accessible units. Those are some thoughts about housing types in CFAs. Any reactions to what I've just said, or other things that we haven't addressed that we should think more about in terms of the next draft of the rules? Sandy.
going to make a more generalized comment at this point. So in Springfield, we had started a development code update before the passage of House Bill 2001. And in doing that update, we were going to no longer regulate by housing type and just regulate by density. But with the passage of House Bill 2001, that made that impractical because of the way the rules were written. We had to regulate by housing type. And so now in the CFAs, going to density, I think makes a certain amount of sense, except, you know, I feel like we're being pulled in two different directions. And that's not just here in terms of how we're complying with House Bill 2001 and then turning around and trying to comply with climate-friendly equitable communities, but it's also like a big thrust of House Bill 2001 and 2003 was to allow opportunity throughout the community of various housing types and densities. And now, we're trying to put more focus on focusing density into these climate-friendly areas. And I just think it's setting us up to not being able to really achieve the objectives of all of it. And one place where that is kind of coming out more is when you are looking at the land use assumptions in 0340, item 4. So we're assuming, basing our future land use assumptions on what's going to happen in the climate-friendly areas, as if we're turning our back on all that we've just done to implement House Bill 2001. So I feel torn.
I understand the concern, Sandy. I guess I'm not seeing a conflict between the two.
Well, I guess in reality, it would come down to like how you're planning your public facilities. So if we're saying we're going to have all this density and accommodating the future growth of our residential units and some of the commercial and industrial in these climate-friendly areas, but in reality, the market is responding by putting housing in where we've now allowed it throughout the rest of the community. But our future infrastructure isn't planning for that because we're planning for all the density to go into the climate-friendly areas. Then what are we going to do? How are we going to be able to, respond in terms of the infrastructure planning? I guess is where I'm seeing the conflict arise.
Yeah, I see that. I think both are needed, quite honestly. I mean, we need to see more housing variety in primarily single family neighborhoods as well. Infrastructure is a big question there. And there was nothing in the bill in House Bill 2001 that really said, cities have to upgrade their infrastructure to, basically meet worst case development scenarios. And so I think what we expect to see over time is with redevelopment, there may need to be some infrastructure upgrades that happen to accommodate middle housing. We also think there's pretty significant capacity remaining in many of these systems for that infill development. Certainly in climate friendly areas, those areas will need to be planned for more significant infrastructure, but many of these areas already have that infrastructure. I mean, to a large degree, we are looking at existing downtowns, or we're looking at sort of new nodal mixed use areas that have been planned or designed before, long before we're actually getting to this step. So I'm not necessarily seeing as much of a conflict, but I understand that infrastructure is a key consideration. Damien.
Thanks, Kevin. Can you elaborate what you're referring to when you describe accessible units? Is that referring to their physical design or accessible because of their price point, rent level, or all the above?
I'm sorry, yeah, accessible to persons with disabilities. So ADA compliant units is what I meant. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Mary Kyle.
I think infrastructure is critical, and we looked at that in depth in 2001. And we know that accommodating a growing population in all these cities is going to require infrastructure somewhere, somehow, and paid for in the various ways in which we try to pay for infrastructure. So we need it. The issue of infrastructure only seems to be raised when we're talking about 2001 or infill and such. And even if it's at the, through a UGB expansion, there will be new infrastructure required and probably a lot more of it and a lot more costly. So I think that's kind of a given that there's going to be some infrastructure upgrades or additions or et cetera required to accommodate growing populations. And what we found in the 2001 rulemaking, or what we concluded, and I think the department has some studies going on now following up to that. I know there's been talk about it, but I think some consultants doing some studies about duplexes are not going to necessarily contain more people than a single family house. If you get to a fourplex or townhomes, maybe, but it's not exponentially more infrastructure, and that existing neighborhoods and town centers and such have a lot of that infrastructure in place, might need to be upgraded, but it's also gradual growth. It's not going to be all at once. So I think we have to acknowledge infrastructure is an issue. Let's get some reality on exactly the size of that issue, the scale of it, and depending on where that growth and what kind of growth is occurring, what kind of housing types, just meet it head on. It's going to be an issue. We're going to need sidewalks, roads, and pipes, new or upgraded, or making more efficient use of the existing roads and infrastructure and transit systems. So we are not meeting the housing needs of Oregonians today the way we've been building for the last 20 or more years. So we're going to have to do it differently, and that means smaller housing options, more compact, more relatively affordable, and in more affordable areas. And that means closer in. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. Jonathan.
Sure. I wanted to echo what Mary Kyle just said in terms of, I worked on 2 very large urban growth boundary expansion areas. And I was participating in part of the public facility planning for those. And the cost of building all that new infrastructure is way, way more than the cost of being able to upgrade sewer pipe, existing sewer pipes, or storm drainage, or those sort of things. So I think that, as Kevin said, these efforts of increasing housing choices and capacity in our traditionally single-family neighborhoods, and addressing housing and more dense housing in climate-friendly areas, the centers and such, are complementary, not in opposition to each other. And minimizing the need for urban growth boundary expansions is a climate response. It needs to be acknowledged. It's just as a minor point, in terms of the housing choices that we talked about, as I read the current rules, they don't preclude jurisdiction from doing attached single family or townhouse development. All the rules say is you have to allow multifamily. So I just, that's just sort of a minor point. Although in the past, there's been a conversation about the current Oregon state rules for being able to do condos is difficult. But probably is not a reason not to allow multifamily or address multifamily as one of the housing choices. Maybe we need to, DLCD could have a footnote to maybe talk to the governor or whomever about once you change those rules to make it easier to do condo projects in terms of allowing for ownership opportunities. Because I've known plenty of people who have appreciated the opportunity to own a condo unit as they transition from their detached single family to multifamily development. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I recognize the issue of condo conversions in particular. It's not within the scope of this rulemaking effort. I think we're hopeful that we'll see some progress there in the future to allow more ownership opportunities. Brock, you appeared briefly. I didn't know if you wanted to add something.
Oh, sorry, I just hit the button by accident.
Oh, no worries. Sorry, didn't mean to call you out there. All right. Let's see. If there's no more. Oh, Bob, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on a slightly different idea or aspect of CFAs and designation, and that's to encourage the department to also set targets for accommodating employment in climate-friendly areas. And this is really critical to achieving VMT. If we don't get jobs in areas that are CFAs, that are walkable and well-served by transit, what we're really saying to employed people is, you got to have a car to get to your job. And once we say that, we're really saying, then you need to live in a place where you have lots of cars. So if we want CFAs to succeed for housing, we really need to put jobs in areas that are accessible by transit. And a lot of those are going to be, the best of those should be climate-friendly areas. So I think there ought to be targets that are aimed at doing that. I've heard, Kevin, you express some concern about that. And I would say, if you're familiar with transportation plans, you know that local governments are already making very detailed forecasts of exactly where employment is going to occur over the next 20 years. Those are basic parts of doing a transportation plan. So we already have local governments doing that. And I would also note that we have 3 of our metropolitan areas, Eugene, Springfield, Rogue Valley, and Salem, that have adopted TPR performance measures that are aimed at the number of employees that are within walking distance of transit. So this is a building block that we've known about for a considerable period of time. It's one I think that's really essential both to making CFAs work and accomplishing VMT reduction.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, I absolutely. This is, it's a piece we have not talked about as much, the employment side. I think the challenge that I see is how to operationalize that in rule in a way. And we have targets in the outcomes-based approach for a CFA. If a local government says, hey, we'd like to prove up on our current development standards, we think they're going to achieve these results, we talk about this many houses and this many jobs per acre as a target. So those targets are in the current draft. But if you have more specific ideas about how to operationalize that in rule, I'd sure appreciate what that looks like to you, or how that might be accomplished.
Sure. Again, one of the things that's already in the rule is a requirement that larger jurisdictions adopt growth forecasts for both housing and employment. And this is in the Goal 12 rule. And I think that's the sort of thing that ought to be done in relation to CFAs. We want to, again, plan for lots of employment, or as much employment as we can within CFAs. And those kind of allocations ought to be adopted, I would think, in conjunction with the CFA designations, or as soon as possible, to guide the next set of plan updates, so that as we are doing economic development planning or transportation planning, we have those forecasts or allocations of growth that target more employment to CFAs.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Damien, you just appeared. I wasn't sure if you wanted to comment on this.
Well, I had a follow-up question from Bob's comments, because I'm thinking ahead to and then this may sound like an obvious question, but it's more of a clarifying one. I'm thinking ahead to next year when the city of Bend's going to begin work on our economic opportunities analysis and updating our employment forecasts. And I think, and this is my clarifying question, I think that would be a good time to start looking at maybe getting a head start on as we look at our employment forecasting and looking at what sectors we're thinking or looking at growing and trying to support more growth in, taking that analysis maybe a step further to more closely look at a potential CFA or CFAs to see where certain industries might be more suitable or more attracted to those kind of environments, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. Yeah, and I will say this is something that we've talked about, providing more tools and guidance, as particularly on the EOA side of things, when local governments do their economic opportunities analyses. That's the time when they look at, where do we want employment to go and what kinds of employment do we want to see in the city? And that is a perfect place for us to talk about employment in climate friendly areas as one part of that. Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Other comments on the employment side of things? Brock, did you want to add something?
I was going to add one other point, just going back to what Jonathan had talked about. I believe it was Jonathan. Talking about the residential home ownership opportunities. We're doing this rulemaking, and it's the climate friendly area is obviously very important, but the whole title of it, climate friendly and equitable, right? And if we're trying to adjust for these longstanding issues that we've had of inequality, I think it's really important that we seriously consider the ability for these communities to be able to own their own homes. It's a huge way to build intergenerational wealth, and I think we're selling ourselves short if that's not something that we're going to really consider. I know that you said that the condominium conversation isn't really part of this, but I think it is something where we look at it and we say, okay, we've done this, we've put this in place. Let's take it from a B to an A, right? Let's not just turn this in and get credit. Like let's really think about like how this is going to go down. And I know that's not 100% within DLCD's purview specifically, but I think it would carry weight if that's something that you brought up.
I think it's an issue that our housing team is very aware of, Brock. And I know there have been some past legislative efforts to make some changes there. I can't speak for the agency at large, but yeah, it's definitely an issue of concern. And we see that we need to build other opportunities for ownership that are more accessible for most Oregonians. And this is one critical part of that, or one critical type of housing. Sean, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll just throw in, like, you're right that this is definitely a theme that we've been hearing a lot, especially as we move into kind of the regional housing needs analysis work. And I think one piece that we're going to be kind of making a core theme of, whatever comes out of this process is ensuring it's, using whatever levers exist at the state level to ensure that we're kind of increasing homeownership options and really kind of breaking that kind of existing dichotomy we have between multifamily as renters and single family as owner occupied, right? And really changing that to make it not correlate so much with the housing type, but with to open that opportunity to more folks. So I think in whatever comes out of these recommendations, obviously, like there's going to be a lot of careful kind of legislative and political considerations that go into that, but we'll be, banging the drum, so to speak, in whatever recommendations we have going forward to say, hey, with all of these land use regulations and changes are good, but if they are not accompanied with state policies to increase, options available to people to own their own homes, we need to do something about that, right? Because otherwise we're going to continue facing these same problems.
Absolutely. I really appreciate hearing that from you guys.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sean. All right, I will move on to cover some of the other changes. I'm getting to the end of my list, but I want to allow some time for other input if there are issues we haven't talked about that we should talk about. I think last time we talked about this idea of not establishing minimum densities within a mixed-use building. So if you have a mixed-use building that has, say it's mostly office, but you want to put in a little bit of residential, that would be allowed. The standard that I think we're contemplating is setting a baseline of, the building needs to meet an FAR, a floor area ratio minimum of 2.0. In other words, that the building area of that building is twice as large as the size of the development site. So that kind of implies your building has some scale vertically and some level of intensity, but that's a change that we're contemplating. I'll pause there if there are any concerns or suggestions for, that change. Comments? Seeing none. All right. Another issue that was raised is just clarifying. So we've talked about allowing dense residential or employment areas that are adjacent to CFAs to basically qualify as part of a CFA. Yes, I think the rules need to clarify that no, we're not looking for those areas now to adopt mixed use zoning as well. The fact that they have dense residential or employment and they're proximate to these climate friendly areas is sufficient, but that I don't think has been clearly expressed in rule. So that will be a change that we'll be making. Let's see, Bob, go ahead.
I wanted to express some concern about that. The standard to count these areas is pretty broad. So we're talking about an area that is half a mile away from a CFA, from edge to edge. That's the straight line distance that you're allowing people to count. First of all, it's not a walking distance. So who knows if there are streets or streets with sidewalks that enable people who live in this high density housing or work in the high density employment area to get from where they are to the real place, the CFA, that functions as a walkable area. So the big bottom line question is here, are we adding areas that are really practically or functionally part of the CFA in terms of creating a walking environment? Again, if we're counting these households and employees as part of CFAs for meeting that target, we better make sure, you better make sure that they really function that way, not that they're just within a half a mile as the crow flies.
I see. And so what I'm hearing you say is your biggest concern there is just that it be within walking distance. Is it the half mile dimension that you're also concerned with, or?
I think a half a mile gets to the feathering the edge. So people who live near light rail in the Portland area may be able to walk, may be willing to walk that distance. But most of the literature says the sweet spot for optimal walking distance is about a quarter of a mile. And again, if you're measuring from the edge of a CFA and you say it has to be 1,000 feet wide, that's still a ways away from the core of the CFA, which is where the attractions are likely to be, the transit, the offices, the shops. So the real question is, I think, do these area concentrations of employment and housing function in a way? Are they close enough so that people can actually walk via pedestrian-friendly streets to get there? And again, I think more like a quarter mile distance. So I would definitely tighten this up, or we're going to end up calling a lot of areas that aren't really walkable CFAs.
Okay. Thank you. Any other comments or reactions to this issue? Jonathan?
Sure. And the concept of having a climate-friendly area that incorporates high-density employment, maybe with allowing mixed use, or having mixed use there, some allowing mixed use and high density residential. It is a matter of design. And I saw what Bob is right that there needs to be language that talks that incorporates how people can get around, and the deliberation of it being attached to the mixed use area. I know the example that I provided staff from this came from the Pleasant Valley Plan District in Gresham, or actually Gresham, Portland, Clackamas, and Multnomah counties, but that did that approach with the town center in Pleasant Valley, so that you had a core area, and then you had adjacent, one across the street, the other just next door. But it was clear in the design standards and the purpose statements for those three sub-districts that they're all one piece. The employment is intended to support the center, and that the residential is intended to support the residential or the mixed use center. So I think having some kind of design or some kind of purpose statement or something like that in the rule might help, about why those are there and what you're expecting of them in terms of being accessible by walking and attached to the transit and those sort of things. It's all part of that area.
Thank you. Sandy?
So when I read these rules, I wasn't understanding the intent of this section. So I appreciate you clarifying what was trying to happen, because I hadn't gotten it before. And I think it makes sense. I think that this provision and how it's written or measured out will have a direct relationship with the dimensional requirements of a climate-friendly area. So if our climate-friendly areas have to have 1,000-foot diameter in all directions, there may be sort of appendages of those that are essentially climate-friendly in nature, but that aren't going to meet that 1,000-foot dimension, but could be a good linkage to these other high-density residential or existing employment. So I think those two things need to be thought of together in terms of this dimensional requirement for your climate-friendly area, and then how do you get to these other supported uses that are within walking distance of those. So changes to one will affect the other, is what I'm trying to say.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's right. And it's a little confusing because I think we say in the rule, these are considered CFAs, but they're not mixed use. And so we need to clean up the language to clearly define that. But what I'm hearing you say too is, it also, we need to amend that as well with the dimensional standard to be clear about what's in and what's out in terms of counting towards that dimensional requirement. Is that
right? What are you
correct?
measuring to and from? What area are you looking at?
Sure.
What are you being able to include or exclude because of these definitions or measurements, which are somewhat arbitrary, but will have meaning, over time?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I think that is pretty much the end of my list of things that we, changes that we're thinking of. And so this is a good time to hear from y'all about, are there other things that you feel, other changes we need to make to the rules? Specific suggestions are always helpful. And of course, why? Recognize what we're trying to accomplish here. So I'll just open up the floor to any additional input or concerns or suggestions. All right. Well, we may be at an end. If there's no more to say today, I just want to say I really appreciate everyone's time, this busy holiday period. I know there are other things you'd probably rather be doing, but this is very helpful to us. And look for that next draft for the next rack packet. So, but I'll pause once again. If there's any other issues people want to bring forward, I see a lot of people coming on camera. This is the time. If not,
If I could just clarify
go ahead,
or just
Damien.
ask, are you still looking at 2 weeks ahead of the next RAC meeting to have the agenda and meeting materials posted?
That is what we're shooting for, Damien.
Okay.
That said, it's conceivable. We got a lot to do in this last packet. I think my opinion is January 10th at the latest. That would give us an additional weekend to work on some of this stuff. But we are shooting for the January 6th deadline. That's 2 weeks prior to our January 20 RAC meeting. And we hope to make that. Go ahead, Matt.
If I recall that there are some of the impact statements, the racial equity statement
That's
that will
right.
not be available on the 6th.
Yep.
And they will be an important part of that RAC meeting. The small business impact statement, the housing cost impact statement, the financial impact statement. Did I miss one, or did I may have got those titles a little wrong?
There's three. We got a housing impact statement, a fiscal impact statement, and a racial equity impact statement. And so, yeah, those will be coming in a separate separate packet to the RAC members a little later. Yeah.
Okay.
But before the 20th, the meeting on the 20th. Yeah, you bet. You bet. Any other questions, Bill? Oh, maybe not. Okay. Go ahead.
I didn't have a question, but one of the reasons of not being a planner, but being an educator and you coming into this group was to try and figure out how to look at all of this CFA, this urban planning models and goals and things, and teach buildings full of high school kids and develop your consumer base for climate friendly housing over the next 10 years. Because that's who's going to be your economic driver for 2030. And I just struggling here with listening to all of this and trying to figure out how I'm going to go into my high schools and say, look at what our leadership is doing in climate friendly areas. I've traveled the world, and I even see places in the Middle East, that are orienting their city streets based on the predominant wind to reduce air conditioning and, looking at how urban designs are reducing the need for water or better efficiencies and in other managements other than just CO2, more than just CO2, but looking at how to efficiently arrange things. And I want to sell that model and go into these civics classes and say, look at the urban planning that we are doing here, but I'm just not getting it. And I'm struggling listening to all this. It's great. I see all the meaning and I see where it's going, but I just don't know how to create your 2030 home buyers that will be all in on this. I know all my kids in all my high schools want climate friendly. They want to deal with these issues, but we're just not able to tell them how. I'm struggling. Sorry to say that, but that's the way I feel.
Well, I think that's a valid perspective, Bill, and I appreciate you sharing it because we're not doing as good a job as we should be about communicating that vision we're trying to build for the future. And so that tells me I need to do a better job of doing that. And I think collectively we need to do a better job of doing that. So thank you. Looks like Mary Kyle and then Bob.
Yeah, I first want to say thank you, Bill. I think that's really sobering. We need to hear that. And I don't, partly is we're not communicating our vision for the future, but we're also not building the future. We're just talking about it. And we need to get a move on because I think that's what the young people of today are looking for, actual actions out of our generation that they haven't seen. But on one thing in the rules, I can't recall exactly the various places where this is in here, but it talks about, you've talked about today too, 30% of housing, of total housing should go in CFAs. And I think it might be easier for planning purposes and just to think about, to talk about that is really half of new capacity needs to be designated in CFAs. I think that's a more direct planning guideline performance measure than 30% of all housing capacity, existing and planned, but just, I think it's just more direct of what actually has to happen.
Okay.
Planning for roughly half the housing capacity. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Bob.
I just wanted to piggyback on that is, realistically, housing in climate friendly areas is going to be the new housing that we build over the next 20 to 30 years. So that's a better measure of what we ought to be aiming at. And if you look at where we are today, and DLCD did that a couple of years ago, only about 15% of households in metropolitan areas live in mixed use or walkable kinds of areas. And that translates, as Mary Kyle is giving you kind of a rule of thumb, is we need to get about half of all the new development that happens in climate friendly areas. And I think that's a lot better direction for planners because, that's what we're aiming at. How do we accommodate that next increment of growth that we're expecting over the next 20 years?
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, and I could, part of the challenge is a communication challenge because, again, we have to navigate the requirements of Goal 10 and existing statute, and yet clearly signal, here's the target, here's where we need to be to meet our climate goals. And we're trying to do that. If we say half of new development has to be in climate friendly areas, that creates a lot. Well, frankly, it's just doesn't work. It's not consistent with existing statute. But that is what we are trying to set the table to make that happen, at least 30%. So, all right. With that, I will let you go. Give you back some time. Again, look for that next draft of rules coming out, and thanks again for the conversation. Enjoy the rest of your holidays.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.